Let's talk a little bit about the week that was in the NFL. Obviously, these playoff slates are some of my favorite slates of the entire year. And I was just, I mean, quite honestly, like tilting pretty hard last night, messaging back and forth with Sean a little bit. Somehow I ended up pretty close to a break-even slate. There was one player that, if things would have broke a little bit differently, probably my biggest slate of the year by far. So I guess that's kind of the way NFL goes sometimes. Really tight edges. Honestly, even KC ended up lower owned in some of the contests I was in than I thought that they should have been. So how did the week go for you overall, Sean? I know you were playing. We're going to look a little bit at some of your main teams on DraftKings. You're playing all three slates. I believe there's a couple other slates that you're in as well in terms of Showdown, but we're going to focus on Classic. Most of my action was on FanDuel, so we'll go through that. But how was the week for you this year, or this week overall in the division round?
The first weekend wild card was really poor. This weekend was break even, but I had a lucky slate. The 2-game slate on FanDuel yesterday
Nice.
was my only good slate of the weekend. DraftKings main, the 4-game was also okay. So I played the 6 slates that involved multiple games. I didn't play the showdowns. I just wasn't really trying to play the showdowns. So I think I lost 4 of the slates, made a little bit on the DraftKings main, but then really had a good lineup on the FanDuel 2-game yesterday. I was winning every GPP pretty much until the last Devontae Adams catch to run out clock. If
Yeah.
he didn't make that catch, or if that catch doesn't happen, I probably have a really, really strong slate and have like a 1,000% ROI on it.
Nothing wrong with getting bailed out. That's what happened to me in the wild card round. Kind of a weird slate overall, but ended up having a bunch of Taysom Hill on FanDuel, which like saved me basically. So like had like one or two teams that did really well and kind of just made the rest of the weekend not so terrible. So that was good. Nothing wrong with getting bailed out, man. But I want to start over on FanDuel, and we'll talk a little bit about I guess what just happened on my action. So for the people that were around on Sunday morning or Saturday morning, I guess we talked about how I was just going to leave a lot of shares open to Patrick Mahomes. If I felt like I enjoyed the way things were going on the slate, maybe I would move some of those to Watson, to Russell Wilson. But if not, I was just going to ride with Mahomes because I thought it was pretty clearly the best spot on the board. Didn't look great early, but in terms of what happened, Dalvin Cook decided to, I guess, just make one more painful stand in my, my season. I feel like every time I played this guy, I just caught the floor. So 5.6 points from Dalvin Cook, obviously not a great start. I ended up keeping him on one of my top teams here. So by the way, this tournament we're looking at is the 3-3-3 on FanDuel. I basically played this with 7 lineups at the $300 level and down on the main slate. So I ended up with some pretty good Mahomes teams when it was all said and done. Had a decent Lamar team that ended up just missing the cash line as well. But this team in ninth did have Dalvin Cook. Honestly, Dalvin Cook has a reasonably poor game and not just an epically terrible game. Have a really good chance to win this. No one ahead of him, ahead of me, would have had Dalvin. Had the Patrick Mahomes stack. This one didn't have Tyreek. Had a good amount of Tyreek as well, which we'll talk about. This one had Fuller coming back. Marquise Brown one off. Talked about that. Like as the slate progresses, grab guys that you think can break the slate as we go. And then Aaron Jones, Green Bay Packers, the team that finished in ninth. This is a 250 person tournament, 25K to first, 7 max, I believe. So I maxed this out at 7 teams. And this other team originally was further back. Let's see if I can actually 8th place team. This team ended actually passing that 9th place team. So this team, very similar team, except for instead of Hollywood, it had Stephon Diggs and it had Debo was the main failure there, but had Aaron Jones, Green Bay Packers, and Marshawn Lynch in that last game. Lynch was an interesting one. This is kind of what you would like expect, like the line to look at, right? Like 2 touchdowns, 26 yards on 12 carries. Pretty bad performance in terms of yardage, but on a site like FanDuel at his price, I thought he was a reasonable guy to stay on, hopefully pass a few people. So these two teams, 8th and 9th, but really tight in terms of the scoring, all the way up to first place, who actually fended off a bunch of teams that were kind of coming for him, including my 2 teams in the top 10. He didn't have anyone in this last game, thankfully. But when I mentioned it before, there was one player that really could have made things go bad for me. Tyler Lockett, 21% owned in this. It just so happened that the Devontae Adams thing didn't really matter a ton in this tournament for some reason, just because I think a lot of the Devontae Adams teams either didn't have Travis Kelce or didn't have full Mahomes stack. So those ones weren't as relevant as Tyler Lockett. So that basically that last drive where he got over 100 yards, got that touchdown, that was the difference of having two teams in the top three and not. So, Sean, how bad did I run here? Am I over-exaggerating a little bit? Obviously, the Dalvin thing really hurts on a team that had a chance to win it with Aaron Jones. Green Bay still left a decent amount of PMR. Green Bay at 8%. I don't know, man. I feel like it could have gone a little better if maybe one thing broke differently on these last two squads.
Yeah, I definitely think you ran bad, worse than you usually do when we have that sort of conversation,
Sure.
because you really needed Lockett was really the only person that could come, and he needed to have, I think he had 35 on FanDuel, which is way more.
Well, I mean, yeah, there was a moment where this team in first, where this is the only team I was really worried about passing. I didn't really think there was much of a chance of people to come up on me anyway. And in order to pass this team, I think all I really needed was a reasonable game from Packers defense at the end, and still would have got there.
Yeah, I mean, when Joe and I were talking, Joe basically said, he's like, yeah, as long as he's basically the only fade is Tyler Lockett. That basically propelled Lockett to a 25-point quarter.
Yeah.
So Joe sort of buried himself there on the mush. But yeah, it was a weird spot because you looked at the roster and you had a team with Lynch, like you said, it ended up passing. And before the last quarter or so of that game, when Lockett exploded, it looked like Joe was probably going to get second and third, and then maybe could get a win if he got a touchdown from Aaron Jones, which obviously didn't happen. Green Bay wasn't really able to move the ball at all towards the end of that game. But yeah, it was looking really good. It looked like you were going to get second and third or second and fourth with outside shot at the win, which, I mean, if you get that, you're getting 10 grand out of these lineups instead of the 2K that you got.
Yeah, honestly, not really tilting not getting the win. More just tilting that all of these teams from basically third to seventh all had Tyler Lockett. So by bubbling this, I mean, the difference between finishing eighth and ninth and finishing second and fourth, decent chunk of change. So that's not great. It's not even just that, honestly. It's all the tournaments underneath it. There's a tournament, I believe, that was 50K to first that I was in the top 10 in. So there's a bunch of teams, both these teams were very live to win. Even at the end. So regardless, in terms of my week overall, like I said, did end up with 5 of 7 Mahomes teams, 100% Damian Williams. I believe that 4 of those teams had Kelce, but ended up moving some shares around with what happened with Dalvin Cook. So ended up on some Deshaun Watson teams. You see one of them right here. Tried to get a little bit weird with some Watson stacks after I had the Kittle failure, after I had the Dalvin Cook failure. So that's essentially, this is the only team I ended up with Seattle defense. I thought they were one of the worst defenses on the slate, which Sean and I talked about. But I guess we didn't actually talk a ton this week, but the one thing you were kind of asking about was Devontae Adams and Seattle D versus, wasn't it Green Bay and Tyreek? And I was definitely on the Tyreek side, so sorry about that, man.
Yeah, no, you definitely confirmation biased me into disaster. I had 3 2v2s that I considered yesterday on the DraftKings 2-game slate. 2 of them were really good, and 1 of them was a total disaster. I ended up on the total disaster. To be fair, I was.
I think you were going to do that either way, right?
Yeah, I was leaning that way anyways. I was hoping that you came in and confirmed a different way, but you confirmed the way that I was going to go, because I thought the same thing you did. So it confirmed me onto that. But yeah, it ended up not being poor, and it was Tyreek and the Green Bay defense versus Seattle and the Packers defense, which ended up losing by about 20 or 25 points, which on the DraftKings 2-game slate was huge.
Yeah, I'll say this too. It's just really tough to pull the trigger on that 2v2 just on Adams versus the defense that he's playing. And I ran into this on one of my teams. Obviously the Lynch was a pivot on this team just because I thought he would give me a chance to pass a few people. But on this team that did have Lynch in eighth, every time Lynch scored, Packers defense lost points. So it's not that running back versus the opposing defense is probably worse. But in terms of pivots and passing people, I think it's fine. But you see it firsthand. It's oh, great. Marshawn scored. Oh, but my defense lost points anyway, so it really didn't matter much. So that's stuff you definitely have to think about. I will say that, well, let's frame it this way. So if you're planning on having a lot of Mahomes and you were basically in some wide open teams, maybe a few failures, sure. Along the way, there's plenty of failures. Maybe you have Debo and a pretty wide open team with Mahomes. There's really not a scenario where you're playing Adams over Tyreek in that spot if that's the roster construction you're on, correct?
Correct. If you have Mahomes and you're trying to win GPPs, you're probably playing Tyreek. The only option where you're not really playing Tyreek is if you have three other guys from Kansas City, which was definitely possible. Like you could easily have had, like you have in this lineup, Damian, Watkins, and Kelsey. So then there's just no room for you to play a guy like Tyreek. So it's one of those situations where on FanDuel you're limited to the four guys. So it makes having Tyreek a little bit more difficult because the four of them, Damian was way cheaper and way too cheap of a play at running back. He was probably, as you can see, he's the highest owned player on this team at running back. And then also Tyreek's ownership on FanDuel kind of shocked me. You see that he's 55%. I thought he was a good play, but if you told me he was 55% in GPP, I would have not really wanted him. Would much rather have guys like Sammy Watkins at 18. And even Kelsey, I think Joe showed, Kelsey was 25%. I'd much rather have Travis Kelsey at 25% than Tyreek at 55%.
For sure. I mean, so the Tyreek team ended up cashing this anyway because it was a full Mahomes stack. No Kelsey on this one. I do think that the argument in favor of maybe doing Adams is you get your Tyreek exposure through Mahomes. You play some of the cheaper pieces like Damian, like Watkins, like Kelsey. Like for me, like Kelsey was like pretty close to a lock with Mahomes. I started out the week with a lot of two tight end Kittle and Kelsey teams. So those Kittle teams needed to make more moves than staying with Kelsey, unfortunately. But in terms of the Kittle exposure, like he was 28%. Kelsey was about the same. I think what ended up helping me, honestly, was exactly what you said. Tyreek ended up at 55. So I think people that were on that roster construction, if you played Adams, you probably didn't have Mahomes, and Mahomes is what you needed to get to the top anyway. So Adams didn't really even hurt me. I don't even think there was a team in the top 10 that had Devontae Adams. It was the Tyler Lockett thing, because essentially if you had some sort of stack with Mahomes and all these guys, you had probably a guy in the mid-range where you could have gotten there with Lockett. In terms of DraftKings, what was kind of surprising, I wanted to really kind of see where the ownership would have landed on Lockett, but overall, we'll look at that in a second. I do think that making some move, I mean, I got pretty aggressive with some pivots. I did have one Jimmy G team, I believe, but also had Dalvin, so it didn't matter. So I got really weird with some pivots in this late game. Tyler Lockett, unfortunately, was only on my teams that were really dead. He ended up being 21% owned anyway, which wasn't great. Maybe I could have gotten a little bit more different there. This Lamar team started the day, I believe even like halfway through the KC game. This team was in second of this tournament, drops all the way to 73rd with all of that Mahomes exposure coming. So just another example of even if you get off to a good start, if there's chalk coming, you still need to make moves if you have no PMR whatsoever. So like in theory, this team started out with McCole Hardman instead of Watkins. I was so far ahead. I decided to stay with Sammy Watkins, but maybe doing something a little bit more unique. Damian was a lock for me, like I said, especially on a team that was ahead. But maybe just staying with Hardman and taking the lower projection, but the upside with the Kansas City defense would have made a little bit more sense, but it didn't even matter with this team. Just outside the cash line, which wasn't great, but dropped a lot with all that chalk coming. So that was interesting. Were you doing much pivoting, I guess, before we get to your team, Sean? Like I know you're playing, you're playing tournaments as well, but mostly cash with that one lineup. So I assume you had a good amount of KC, so maybe you didn't have to do a ton of pivoting overall.
I was actually in decent shape on both sites on the 4 game. So on DraftKings on the 4 game, I had Lamar, Hollywood, Kittle, and
well, let's look at it. I'll bring it up right now.
On the DraftKings 4 game, I'm trying to remember the last person I had. So I had
right here.
Yep, I had Corey Davis, who was fine too. So of the players that I had the day before, Kittle was a disaster, but he was very heavily owned. Corey Davis was fine for what you got out of him. Hollywood was very good. Lamar was very good on DraftKings. So I was in good shape because Emmanuel Sanders and Debo were both 50 to 60% owned as well. So based on the fact I only had Kittle and Lamar did really well and Marquise did really well, I was in pretty good shape. So I didn't really have to make any pivots there. And then once that game was over, there was nothing I could do. And this lineup did okay. And then FanDuel, I made the decision going in. And again, I was in really good shape. I had Aaron Jones and Alan Lazard basically versus Travis Kelsey and 4 points. So I was in good shape on both 4 game slates. I just got a really bad run out on both of them with Mahomes going completely nuts.
For sure. Forgot to shout out too earlier in the stream, BPV. Thanks for your tier 1, man. Really appreciate that. Just got a Twitch Prime sub as well. DK Slayer 69. Nice. Thanks for your Twitch Prime, man. Been with us for 3 months. I always want to remind you guys too, if you have access to an Amazon Prime account, make sure you're taking advantage of that free Twitch Prime subscription. You'll get access to my data sheet each and every week, and just that's kind of the best way you can support what I'm trying to do here for free. Corey Davis on DraftKings was more just a necessity at this point, right? He was 3,700. I believe your boy Empire Maker had a nice little bet going on Twitter if he was going to get another goose egg. So nice that he got the receiving touchdown from Derrick Henry. Man, I don't even know what is there to say about Derrick Henry, man. Like the math, just like it makes it so hard to play this guy, especially on DraftKings and at his price point. On FanDuel, he was like 9,600. So I did end up having one share of him out of my 7 teams, which was on that Lamar team, which didn't end up mattering tons. But talk a little bit about getting there with Corey Davis finally. But I guess what have you been doing with Derrick Henry? You've been light on him like me as well.
Yeah, I got lucky last week. The 2-game slates I had Henry because it just sort of worked. This week he didn't work on the 2-game slate, so I didn't have him anywhere. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. He almost never makes sense, and it's kind of difficult. Yeah, we were talking to Empire Maker. He was adamant that he was doing it if he didn't get the catch. So I would say going out of halftime that he was probably a big underdog for Corey Davis to get a stat. So it was definitely a situation where if you guys don't know Empire Maker, of all people that could possibly do what he said he was going to do, and for those that don't know, he said he was going to chop off his dick if there was not a point scored by Corey Davis this week. And he was adamant that his word is his word, and if he did not, he was going to do it. If there's someone that would do something like that, it would be him. So we luckily avoided that. But Corey Davis is tough because if Tennessee has to throw, Corey Davis is on the field every play. It's very likely he's going to get targets and have a decent game.
Right.
So you just sort of have to play. Like, I didn't think Tennessee would stomp Baltimore. If you thought that would be the case, you don't play a guy like Corey Davis. You don't consider a guy like A.J. Brown. So it makes it difficult. But so going into the 4-game slate on DraftKings, I was playing Lamar based on the fact all the receivers to me were sort of garbage. And I like the 2 tight ends. So if I played Lamar and I ran these 3 cheaper receivers, and I liked Marquise a lot and I liked Sammy Watkins a lot, so Corey Davis made it fit. And the thing for me was I didn't think playing Debo was worth me playing Mahomes because Lamar just runs so much. We can sort of talk about Lamar had 1 touchdown and had 36 DraftKings points. It was kind of weird because he ran really, 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 really bad and then ran really, really, really good at the end to sort of double bonus and get a touchdown.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a really weird game for Lamar. And then Mahomes ran really, really, really good in the fact that they were down massively in the game.
If you had Mahomes shares and you watched the beginning of that game, you were pumped because you knew the rest of the game they were throwing. It was great.
Put it this way. On this 4-game slate on DraftKings, after they were down 21-0, I'm like, well, I'm done. There's no chance because Mahomes is just going to match Lamar after that happens, no matter what.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I thought going into Lamar and Mahomes were 2 really, really good plays. But the problem is Lamar just runs the ball way too many times for me to pass over a guy. My 2v2 was Lamar and Sammy versus Debo and Mahomes, and I just couldn't justify jamming in Debo. I told myself if I'm going to rely on one player to win a slate, I'd rather rely on Lamar Jackson than Debo Samuel.
That's fair. One thing that I was looking at, and I don't know, would you have had any salary left on the table on this team? Do you even remember?
I think this is zeroed out.
Okay. So I guess, and I'll bring us over quickly to the spreadsheet because the one thing that I was looking at is I would have preferred probably not to play Kansas City defense with basically the onslaught anyways. I loved KC defense. We talked about them a lot. If you would have moved down to Green Bay getting an extra 400, I don't think that would have really done much to your Corey Davis share, would it have? I don't think you really could have gotten anything anyway.
No, I don't think there was anyone above you. That spot was basically Corey Davis or like Tajay Sharp or someone.
Okay.
You could not have got to Lazard.
Yeah.
The other option is I did consider San Francisco defense straight up over Kansas City's and unfortunately chose wrong. I still think if I had it over again, I would take Kansas City's defense again, though.
I liked both. I guess it's always kind of tough when you. It was a great spot for KC. Because playing the full Chiefs onslaught with the defense isn't something that I normally do. But you're kind of in a weird salary range there because you had all the locks outside of that. You had Damian, you had Aaron Jones, you had Marquise Brown, who at that price point was like he was basically a necessity on DraftKings at 4,400, especially if you're playing Lamar. Obviously, Kittle and Kelsey together was a construction that pretty much all of the higher stakes guys went with. So was there any moment where you decided that you were just going to play both these guys? Did you get nervous when Kittle obviously failed? Like, was there pivot decisions at that point, or did you just basically think that after what happened with Lamar, you're fine to stay with the rest of your KC?
Yeah, no, I knew right away. My locks going in were Aaron Jones, Damian Williams, Hollywood, Kittle, and Kelsey. Those 5 I was playing for sure. Mm-hmm. And then I was between Lamar or Mahomes, and then I was between the other spots were just going to sort of fill in based on what worked the best. And so I was always playing the two tight ends. The thing was, like I said, I was not really that concerned. I wasn't thrilled, obviously, with Kittle's game because it was terrible.
Sure.
But Debo was 50 to 60%, and so was Emmanuel Sanders. And what I do is I look through the 250 double up, and I see where I'm at compared to the regs. There's usually a few train lineups that the regs play, because those are generally the most optimal lineups. I know TJ ran one, I think.
All right, I'm gonna look at him.
So if you look up, so you can probably look up one of those lineups if you type in TJ's. I assume he probably had this.
This is
one of the other constructions I considered.
Yep.
And he had this. Yeah, so he had a slightly different one, but this was a very reg heavy lineup as well.
Just being willing to go down to the Seahawks would get you up to Debo essentially.
Correct. All the reg heavy lineups had Debo and or Emmanuel Sanders.
Right.
So with all of them having Debo and Emmanuel Sanders and Kittle, I knew I was in a pretty good shape anyways. And going in, I knew that there would be a heavy chalk on the Mahomes and Debo 2v2 to my Lamar and Sammy. So I was definitely sort of focusing on if I could beat that. And with Debo only having 7 points, I'm decently ahead of that.
That's fair. Shout out hashtag Steve in the chat. One more catch for Lockett. Yeah, so like Steve and I were kind of going back and forth last night. I was just basically tilting every time that Lockett got catches, but those were helping Steve. But apparently he didn't get all the way up there, unfortunately. But he had some awesome teams today, or this past week on FanDuel as well. So I guess we kind of skipped over this, Sean, but your Saturday only team also had Lamar, had Marquise, had Andrews, bringing it back with Corey Davis. So a little bit of a mini stack there. This was your Dalvin team, though, and I know this slate in particular, the Saturday slate was a little bit weak at running back if you didn't want to go the Derrick Henry route. So Mostert, I had a full fade on San Francisco. I just wasn't going to play these guys. I considered at one point, if I would have been rolling probably even 20 teams or more, maybe would have had a few shares of Coleman, Breda, those to get. Like, I wasn't going to play Mostert at that ownership, but so this probably ended up being more of a block at 67%. It was a tougher slate in terms of salary and all of that, but I don't know. There just wasn't a lot of great options. So this is what you ended up with. Were you tilting Dalvin at all? At that point, I guess 76%. He was kind of necessity anyway.
I wasn't really tilting Dalvin. I would have preferred him. I think I had him on FanDuel as well, and he wasn't as high owned. And when he doesn't go off, you're just like, well, you lose to everyone that has Derrick Henry because their price points were similar.
Yep.
I never wanted to play Mostert. I've looked at the logs. He's playing like 25, 30 snaps a game. He
doesn't
make sense. Yeah. So I really didn't want to play him, but there was nowhere else to go. There was nothing to do. I did consider, I think it was like one of the nut lineups, if you scroll all the way up, I considered playing Tevin Coleman just because I thought Mostert was trash, pretty much.
And he's 3,500.
I considered this lineup with Tevin Coleman in the lineup, but I just couldn't justify doing it because the upgrade to like Diggs wasn't that huge, and like the upgrades just weren't that massive. So I considered it, but then I just sort of tucked in and played Mostert because he was going to be heavy chalk. But going into the game, I had no interest in Mostert. I thought he was a kind of trash play. It turned out he was pretty trash, but it was sort of, he got hurt and stuff too. But if you look through the past couple weeks game logs, he's playing like 25 to 30 snaps. Coleman's playing like 15. So neither of them are good plays. Neither of them are going to get very many touches.
I mean, to be fair, I still had him projected for like 16 touches, which isn't horrendous. I don't know. Was there any consideration for Gus Edwards? I know Steve was on him a little bit on FanDuel. Maybe if the game script would have gone a little bit differently in Baltimore, we could have seen a little bit more Gus Edwards than people realizing with that calf injury for Ingram. So his price would have gotten you probably not a whole lot different in terms of your construction. But did you consider that? I guess I would have been avoiding, especially if I was playing Debo and Kittle, just avoiding the Mostert thing like the plague, I think.
Yeah, I considered Gus the bust, but more so on FanDuel where he was quite a bit cheaper. Plus, he's not going to catch very many balls, so PPR wise, he's not good. I definitely had Andrew regrets. He looked awful. He definitely wasn't good. He was not someone that was ready to play in that game. But again, like you look at this game, Minnesota looked awful. They couldn't move the ball at all. You look at the 49ers, they did nothing outside of Tevin Coleman. Everyone was trash. As you'd expect, they're just not very good for fantasy. So that takes out two teams entirely. And then you have Baltimore. All their receivers are straight garbage other than Hollywood Brown. And then you have Andrews. And then you have Tennessee. Everyone on their team stinks except for Derrick Henry. So, like going in, if you look at this slate, it was just really terrible.
Really
if I could do the slate over again, and I sort of looked at it, and this was part of the problem is I couldn't get there. If I could have got there doing this, I would have done this. I would have liked to have just played Derrick Henry because Derrick Henry was going to get volume.
Sure.
So I wanted to do something where I didn't play Mostert, I did not play Mark Andrews, and I played Coleman and Derrick Henry. The problem is it didn't work. It didn't fit. I needed to shave more salary, and below Debo, there was nothing. There was like a big nothingness. You would have had to take someone that was probably not going to get more than like 3 points. So I just couldn't justify it. And also, I didn't think that Derrick Henry was a good play because he wasn't. He just isn't a good play.
Yeah.
So it was just a rough situation.
I guess talk me through quickly, and then we'll move on. Minnesota defense, they were not in my pool this week just because like Jimmy G's not someone that really turns the ball over a ton. I guess thought they were going to skew a little bit more run heavy, like in particular. Just the first game, I get it's 2-game slate, all of that. They were 2,700. I don't know, maybe finding the extra 300 for San Fran would have made some sense, but it's splitting hairs on these smaller slates anyway. It looks like Minnesota was owned a decent amount anyways. But
there was nowhere to shave the 300.
So at that point, you just take the defense and just hope that it's the volatile position that it is.
Correct. Like Lamar, there was no one below Lamar. There was no one below Dalvin. Below Mostert, you would have had to play Gus the Bus. Below Debo, there was no one. Below Hollywood, there was no one. Below the tight ends, there was no one. You would have had to punt a tight end and play like Jonnu Smith or something. Or you would have had to play like two tight end receivers. And then again, you would have ended up with like 1,500 in salary that just didn't work.
So Saturday only, like just like glancing at this team, kind of shocking that it didn't get there in double ups. What do you think kind of went wrong with this Mahomes stack? Seems like you had like all the guys, honestly. No Devontae Adams, no Lockett, basically.
It was Tyreek Hill. I needed to not play Tyreek Hill.
Yeah.
And this is where we go into the discussions. My options were Tyreek Hill and Packers D or Devontae Adams and Seahawks D.
Got it.
My other options were Jimmy Graham over Darren Fells, and then Devontae Adams over Tyreek Hill.
Yep.
And then the other option was to do Tyler Lockett, Jacob Hollister, and someone over Alan Lazard, who I don't remember. Who was it?
There's no way you're probably doing that one, though.
I know. I talked myself off it, especially I had Tyler Lockett on FanDuel, and he's a better play on FanDuel. So sure. I talked myself off of that one quickly, and it realistically came down to Devontae and the Seattle defense, which I'm sure if you scroll up, you probably look at like 190. That's probably about where that lineup ended up. And that lineup probably did fairly well with Devontae because Devontae had 39. So
he was 60% too. That's not surprising on a 2-game slate, but just him versus that's how like literally how small the line is. Like Devontae versus Tyreek, good game. You're probably not cashing because that's the construction that like if you had the right one, you made money. If you didn't have the right one, you lost. That's kind of where we're at, man. It's brutal.
And all of these, like you see, this is a 2v2 off of or 3v3 off of what I had, and the fuller part's kind of irrelevant.
Yep. Man, that's crazy. In general, I think that the Darren Fells thing in hindsight makes some sense, especially on this slate. Like, it's so brutal at running back overall that I think that if you ended up on some 2 tight end teams, made a lot of sense for sure. I think that's pretty much it on DraftKings. Anything else in terms of this week? Things you wish you would have done a little bit differently across the playoff weeks overall? Like 2 weeks in a row, like having some decent sweats, but not quite getting there at the end. That's GPP life for you. It's the way it is. I guess feel somewhat fortunate to get out of last week alive. This week, probably deserved better, but that's the way she goes. Any kind of final thoughts on the division round, Sean?
Yeah, I felt I deserved to lose on the 4 game. I thought my Tyreek decision looking back was terrible. I think he ran bad, but Devontae's so much safer. I should have played Devontae. So I definitely had regrets on that. The thing that sort of has stunk for me is that I haven't really been able to swap. I've either been in a good position and then I just don't pull through, or I'm in a position where I just have no one left and no one to swap onto. Like last night on the DraftKings main, I had Aaron Jones left. Can't do anything there. On FanDuel on the 4 game, I didn't have Travis Kelce. So when she goes nuts, I just lose. There's really no option but to lose.
Yep.
So it sort of stinks that I haven't really had the ability to swap because most people don't do it, and most people just sort of forfeit their equity swapping. I look at the stuff and I look to see, like, I knew exactly where I stood with every reg heavy train on each site. And I knew I was in a positive spot against all of them, or it got to a point where I'm just dead and there's just nothing you can do.
So the problem with this year's playoff slates is the chalk has been in game 3, both games, both weeks. I would prefer there to be more chalk early because it's easy for people to be like, oh, I don't want to play this Vikings like 49ers game. It gets better from my perspective if you can grab good plays along the way from games that maybe people are heavy on that don't quite get there, but you get the correct pieces, and then you end up on a low-owned stack. It was pretty hard to get a low-owned good stack when it was pretty clearly New Orleans and KC the next week. So it was a hard playoff season, I think, to really go with that approach along the way. Because sure, I moved off some of Mahomes, some teams that like had Dalvin Cook, like those type of situations. But at that point, like I'm kind of with you. I did less swapping this year by far than I think I did the last 2 years combined. And I think that'd be why. Do you think the order of the game is the reason for that?
I think that what hurt compared to previous years is there was no offensive teams. Previous years, you've had offensive options. If you look through the teams that played this weekend, San Francisco is terrible from DFS. You can't do anything.
Nothing. Just the wide receivers.
Tennessee is terrible for DFS. Green Bay is not great for DFS. Seattle is not good at all for DFS. Baltimore, you literally have like Lamar and Hollywood. That's it. Kansas City is okay. Kansas City's not bad. But you look at these games like Houston, again, okay. You just don't have the offenses. Previous years, you'd have like Pittsburgh. You'd have these teams that had 3 or 4 pieces. This week, you're talking about Tennessee. They had 1 piece, literally 1 piece, nothing else. San Francisco had 0 pieces. Literally no one else, no one in the game was playable. I mean, Tevin Coleman got there, so like 1 piece. So like these games just can have teams that had playable options. So even if you're swapping, you're like, okay, I'm going to swap onto this guy who's just terrible instead of like actual people that could get volume and produce.
Yeah, so then you end up with these guys that like are extremely. If the chalk ends up getting there, like it does for KC, you need the right combination at that point. So if you had Tyreek Hill, good game. If you didn't have Kelce on your Mahomes stack, good game. So that those are always tough slates to get all the way to the top unless you run completely pure. You want to learn more about how to be a profitable DraftKings and FanDuel player? Start now by hitting the subscribe icon in the bottom right-hand corner so you don't miss anything. If you can't wait until the next live stream on Twitch, make sure you come hang out with us in the Discord. Link in the description. I'll see you guys there.